Hello everyone, this is Bill Griffin. Welcome to Different Take Podcast. Different Take today is that World War II did not end the Great Depression. This is an episode on the Great Depression and the New Deal, and this is a sequel to that. We teach in U.S. history, and it's just sort of common knowledge for many years, that government spending in World War II created an economic boom that ended the Great Depression. Well, I'm a bit of a numbers guy, and there's always a story behind the numbers. So when you look at GDP growth, you have to think about the fact that the United States economy or production, manufacturing production, was shifted over to military equipment, material, and so forth. And you did have very low income. But that spending on the military did nothing to improve the standard of living for the people in the United States. So I just want to walk through that. In our history books, and I have a history book here from Gwinnett County School, where I live in Georgia. It's called Out of Many. So I'd just like to walk through some passages in this textbook to give you an idea of what we're teaching people and what they kind of accept as conventional wisdom. When you think about it, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's we're teaching people very contradictory things. So this is from American History textbook, Out of Many, page 745, chapter 24. It says, regarding the New Deal, it was never able to bring full economic recovery or end the scourge of mass unemployment. Only the economic boom that accompanied World War II would do that. Okay, scourge of mass unemployment. That would mean, when I hear the term scourge, that it's a terrible thing, mass unemployment, lots of problems, Great Depression, hunger, housing, standard of living, just not good. And then you go into World War II and what was life during World War II, which, granted, was necessary. I certainly will accept that. But it did nothing to improve the lot of people. So there's some passages here that indicate otherwise. Now, leftists like to teach this stuff because it's teaching that government is the answer to people's suffering. But there are several passages here that are really, the same history book contradicts what people are going through. So this is page 757. The war would lift the United States out of the Great Depression and create the biggest economic boom in the history of any nation. But first, the entire civilian economy had to be both expanded and transformed for the production of arms and other military supplies. As I said, if you take the production of arms and military supplies out of the economy, you would still have a Great Depression, because there were other things that needed to happen, which did happen after the war, which we'll get to, lower taxes and that sort of thing. Page 758. Businesses scored huge profits from military contracts. The government provided low interest loans and even direct subsidies for the expansion of construction facilities, so forth and so on. It depends upon how you define profits. That assumes that people were prosperous. Tax rates were, for people making $10,000, was 29%, going all the way up to 70% for $100,000. You go lower, it's 26,000 was 51%. Of course, if you're making $26,000 back during World War II, you were doing very well, but there weren't a lot of people making that kind of money during World War II. There was the idea that businesses were just doing great was not reflected in the value of the companies in the stock market. The Dow Jones Industrial Average opened 1937 at 178 points. In 1945, it opened at 152. The idea that this history book is telling students businesses scored huge profits. Yes, I'm sure some businesses did well, but across the board, the impression is that corporate America was doing great is just ridiculous. The sacrifices by the citizens were incredible. The things that they had to do, the rationing, sending their sons and daughters off to war, fatherless children, just off the charts, the sacrifices that were made. And to try to create this picture that everything was rosy is just really, really amazing. But there's a reason that they do this. So this is from same textbook, page 760, The Home Front. Most Americans thoroughly appreciated the burst of prosperity brought on by wartime production. But they also experienced dramatic and unanticipated changes in the ways they worked and lived. Food rationing, long work days, and separation from loved ones were just a few of the new conditions of daily life. So I guess it depends on what you mean by prosperity. There were something like 420,000 Americans died. I think 17 million were served in the military in some capacity, and 670,000 were wounded. Just calling this prosperous is just, it's sort of mind-boggling. My definition of prosperous, this is not it. It goes on to some other passages. On page 761, housing shortages were acute and rents were high. Later on, extra planning was necessary for purchasing government ration staples such as meat, cheese, sugar, milk, coffee, gasoline, and even shoes. Page 762, gangs formed in major urban areas, leading to brawling, prostitution, or automobile thefts. And they also say that there were complaints for sexual offenses because a lot of the men were in the military. There was this concept called victory gardens, which was the government pressing people to grow their own food because there was a shortage of food production because so much of the economy was shifted towards building planes and aircraft carriers and so forth. It certainly couldn't have been prosperous for 110,000 people who were interned because they were Japanese. So you have over 1 million Americans who died or were injured in World War II, and then on top of that, there were 120,000 Americans who were POWs. As I said, there's the numbers, yes, GDP, the government numbers for GDP was lots of growth during those years, but it was to produce things, albeit necessary, that were not improving the lot of the average person. I quoted some numbers from Dow Jones Industrial Average to give you an idea that World War II was not this boon that is reflected in the production of consumer goods that people would want, need to improve their lives, is reflected in the value of these companies. Average daily closing price in 1927, which was before the high of 1929, which is an outlier. But in 1927 was 176 points. In 1949, it was 180 points, was the average closing price. So it's very little change. That is a 20-year period from 1927 to 1947. Very little change in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. If you take the year 1930, which was the Depression was in full swing, 1930, average Dow Jones Industrial Average, the index was at 236, and it did not get back to that level until 1951. So we're talking about if World War II was such a great thing for American prosperity, then why isn't it reflected in the values of these companies that produce the things that Americans wanted and need? They've always been, was a leading indicator at the time, and has been for many, many years. It makes perfect sense, perfectly logical. For example, you can buy a new car. Ford was the big automaker at the time. They didn't produce cars. They produced military equipment. And at one point, they were producing one B-24 Liberator an hour. According to this website, Quora.com, I'm not familiar with it, but we'll assume this is pretty accurate. The United States Navy started World War II with 7 aircraft carriers. Another roughly 160 aircraft carriers were built during the war, including 24 Essex-class fleet carriers capable of carrying 90 to 110 aircraft. So imagine, just for those aircraft carriers, the number of airplanes that had to be built, the number of support vessels that had to be built. The resources are just staggering. Those resources, albeit necessary, did nothing to improve the lot of the average person in the United States, but this history book tells you otherwise. That is the impression that they clearly paint. The Great Depression was awful, and World War II fixed everything. It just doesn't make any sense at all. For example, and people my age, there's plenty of these stories. My grandfather was a POW in World War II. He died at an early age. He was never wealthy. Matter of fact, he was far, far from it. So the idea that World War II was a great thing and lifted people out of the misery of the Depression is just ridiculous. So if you Google the words World War II, Great Depression, you might come up with this quote. World War II had a profound and multifaceted impact on the American economy. Most obviously, it lifted the nation out of the Great Depression of the 1930s. If you want to call the technical term for depression, because the GDP growth ended the Depression, what people would think of as it lived through the Great Depression, it didn't lift their lives, it didn't change their lives much at all. It made some of them, I'm sure, better, but many, many, many worse. That concept just doesn't make a lot of sense, but it is echoed by none other than Paul Krugman, New York Times columnist, Nobel Prize winner in economics, and he claims in a quote this quote is from a column in 2008 called Franklin Delano Obama. So what he's doing in this column is claiming that what saved the economy and the New Deal was the enormous public works project known as World War II, which finally provided a fiscal stimulus adequate to the economy's needs. He goes on later in this column, which was written in 2008. 2008, the Great Recession, real estate bust, caused a lot of havoc in the United States economy, and the egghead Paul Krugman says it can all be solved if only government spends a lot and a lot of money. So this is his belief. It's no matter how he looks at things, it is through the prism that government must spend a lot of money. He claims that in this column that in 2008 that it was that Obama could not get him out of this situation. He's just elected in 2008. Something like New Deal spending on steroids will fix the problem. In this column, he says, can Mr. Obama achieve something comparable? He's referring to the putting in programs such as the New Deal, Social Security, and expanding government entitlement programs and that sort of thing. Can Mr. Obama achieve something comparable? Rahm Emanuel, Mr. Obama's new chief of staff, has declared that you don't ever want a crisis to go to waste. Progressives hope that the Obama administration, like the New Deal, will respond to the current economic and financial crisis by creating institutions, especially a universal health care system, which of course was passed. Not a universal health care system, but was passed, but new government program known as Obamacare was passed during his early I think it was 2009, that will change the shape of American society for generations to come. So he is a big believer in government spending, and this is the reason that leftists push this idea through textbooks like this one, that government spending is necessary. Free market economics is a bad idea. Government has to have control, and that's the way that they think. That's what they're going to push. This particular response to that from the Foundation for Economic Education. So this is from an article October 23rd, 2009 by Richard Fulmer, and this is a passage from that. Quote, during the war, the P in GDP largely consisted of the munitions needed to defeat the Axis powers. While these weapons were necessary to win the war, they did nothing to provide food, clothing, and shelter. Despite all the production increases that came with the war, the American people were materially worse off while it lasted. Some 15 million American men and women, over 10% of the population, served in the armed forces. Living and sometimes dying in a foxhole was not an improvement over stateside life. Even life during the worst of the Depression. Back in the States, living standards also dropped, though not as dramatically as consumer goods, including food and gasoline, were rationed. Krugman, however, is interested in jobs rather than production. He wants the government to spend massive amounts of money and is relatively indifferent as to how the money is spent. Let the government borrow money and use the funds to finance public investment projects, if possible, to good purpose, but that is a secondary consideration. Krugman is a quintessential liberal. He's a leftist that believes that government, that he knows the answer to the sufferings that people have and how to improve their lives, and it's through government spending. If only the correct people were spending the money and wouldn't take advantage of the power that they would have. This is pie in the sky sort of reasoning to most rational people. Again, this is minority opinion because the left is so dominant in academics and so interspersed into academia, then they're just overwhelming. And the narrative, I hate that word because it's just means it's made up in most cases. This is from a Forbes article from November 2013. This is from Peter Ferrara in Forbes magazine. A common fallacy is that the Great Depression was ended by the explosive spending of World War II. But World War II actually institutionalized the sharp decline in the standard of living caused by the Great Depression, even according to this textbook. The Depression was actually ended and prosperity restored by the sharp reductions in spending, taxes, and regulation at the end of World War II, exactly contrary to the analysis of Keynesian so-called economists such as Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman is generally wrong about a lot of things. When Donald Trump was elected in November 2016, the very next morning, he is quoted as saying in a column, in answer to the question, what will happen with the markets, the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, and so forth. He says, still, I guess people want an answer. If the question is when markets will recover, a first pass answer is never. So the election of Donald Trump meant that the markets would not recover, ever. This was a permanent, ever's a long time. He's a smart man, and he's according to him, if you ask him, he's a smart man. But he's not very smart at making, he's smart enough to keep a job at the New York Times and win a Nobel Prize, but his predictions as far as economics goes, he has a long history of being wrong. So why would you expect him to be right about government spending? Depends on what you mean by changing people's lives and making them better, I suppose. But I don't trust him. So Paul Krugman elects a stock market crash and that will never recover. And the facts are really quite different. Donald Trump, when he was elected, market closed November 8th, 2016, election day, closed at 18,400 points. And today, January 1st, 2022, it is at 36,338. That's how great Paul Krugman is with predicting what will happen in the economy. The upshot of all this is, the takeaway from me is that leftist, Marxist, media, academics, they are so tied to the idea that government spending is a great thing, expanding the government, expanding control over the citizens in the United States. It's so ingrained that they can't see things that are just so obvious, or they're just so, the woke culture, the idea that social media is driving the masses. They're either trying to keep power or distribute power, or they really believe that government's the answer. I think you can do your own research on this, but common sense would dictate that it's most often not the case. It's just sort of common sense that people's lives would have been worse under World War II. Not better. They've been less prosperous. You think what you want. I just don't think government spending, government control is going to help the average person in their daily life very much. But that's my take. World War II spending did not end the Great Depression as I define it, which is a pretty miserable period of time. Misery continued at the start of World War II up until even past that, because of the big disruption in the economy from switching from where you're totally focused on production of war material to producing consumer goods. That's my take. I hope you got something out of it. I really appreciate your watching and listening. Please check out our website, the platforms that we're on. If you have any comments, I would love to hear them. Thank you.